The rain hit the kitchen window so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. I was standing by the sink, a wet towel in my hands, looking out at the dark sky that had swallowed the afternoon. My name is Will, and I build things for a living, mostly wood frames and custom porches, which is exactly why I was standing in a house I used to visit every Sunday for dinner. Claire walked into the kitchen holding 2 white ceramic mugs, the steam rising up and disappearing into the low light of the room. She was Jess's mom. I dated Jess for 3 years, and even though we ended things 2 years ago and went our separate ways with no hard feelings, Claire never stopped treating me like family. She still called me when the old house started showing its age, and I still drove over to fix it. That was the night the storm trapped us, but to understand how we got there, you have to go back to the morning. The sky had been clear when I pulled into her driveway at 8 o'clock. I had a truck bed full of treated lumber and a plan to replace the rotting boards on her back deck before the local news weather warnings came true. The air was heavy, the kind of summer humidity that sticks to your skin the second you step outside. I had my tool belt on and was already pulling up the first bad board when the back door opened. "You are going to melt out here before noon," Claire said, stepping onto the solid part of the deck. She was holding a tall glass of ice water. She set it on the railing. "I've worked in worse," I said, wiping my forehead with the back of my arm. "Just trying to beat the rain." "Well, the news said it might miss us," she said, looking up at the sky. She crossed her arms. She was wearing a simple gray sweater and faded blue jeans, her bare feet on the warm wood. She always looked comfortable, like she belonged exactly where she was standing. "But if it doesn't, you come inside. I'm not having you get struck by lightning trying to save my old deck." "Yes, ma'am," I said, smiling a little as I reached for the water. She gave me a small warm smile back, shook her head and went back inside the house. That should have been the end of it. I went back to work. For the next 3 hours, it was just the sound of my hammer, the buzz of my saw, and the slow creep of dark clouds coming over the tree line. The house was quiet. Claire worked from home, running a small accounting business from her dining room table. I would catch glimpses of her through the sliding glass door every now and then. She would be typing on her laptop or talking on the phone, pushing a stray piece of hair behind her ear. By 1 in the afternoon, the wind started to pick up. The leaves in the big oak tree out back began to rustle loud enough to drown out the radio I had playing in my truck. I was cutting the last few boards, rushing to get them nailed down. The sliding door opened again. "Will," she said. Her voice was calm, but she had to speak up over the wind. "They just upgraded the storm warning. It's going to be bad. You need to stop." "Give me 10 minutes, I called back over the noise. "I just need to seal this edge." 10 minutes, she said. "Then I'm locking the door and leaving you out here." It was a joke, a simple back and forth, the kind of easy talk we always had. I finished the edge, packed my power tools into the heavy plastic bins and carried them toward my truck. The first drop of rain hit my shoulder as I closed the tailgate. By the time I turned around, the sky opened up completely. I ran for the back door, boots slipping a little on the wet grass, and ducked inside the kitchen just as a massive clap of thunder shook the floorboards. I stood there on the mat, dripping water onto the floor, trying to catch my breath. Claire was standing by the stove. She turned around and tossed me a clean, dry towel. "I told you," she said. "You did," I said, catching the towel. I started drying my hair, feeling the cold air conditioning of the house hit my wet shirt. "I made coffee," she said, pointing to the pot. "If you want some. Looks like you might be stuck here for a little bit." "Just until it passes," I said. We moved into the living room. This was the first time we were really just sitting together all day. Usually I was working, or if I was here back in the day, the house was full of people. Jess, her dad before he passed away, cousins, friends. Now it was just the two of us sitting on opposite ends of the long fabric couch, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. "How's work been?" she asked, pulling her legs up underneath her. It was a completely normal question. "Good," I said. "Busy. A lot of people wanting new kitchens before the holidays. It keeps me moving." "You always liked moving," she said softly. She took a sip of her coffee. "Jess told me you were thinking about buying that old property by the lake." I said. "Decided against it. Too much space for one person." She didn't say anything to that right away. She just looked down at her mug, tracing the rim with her thumb. The living room was dark because of the storm, the only light coming from the small lamp in the corner. For a second, the silence stretched out. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was quiet. Very quiet. She looked up from her mug and looked at me. Her eyes stayed on mine for a second. Just 1 second. Not long enough to mean anything, but just long enough for me to notice the steady, quiet way she was watching me. I looked away, taking a drink of my coffee. I told myself I was just tired from the heat outside. I told myself she was just being a good host, making polite conversation with the guy fixing her house. I set my mug down on the coaster and asked her about her accounting business to change the subject. But I couldn't stop thinking about how quiet the house felt, and how still she looked sitting there in the low light. The rain kept falling. We spent the next hour just talking. Simple things. She told me about a client who couldn't figure out his taxes. I told her about a stray dog that kept stealing my measuring tape at my last job site. It was easy. We laughed a little. The kind of low, comfortable laughter you only have with someone you've known for years. At one point the lights flickered. We both looked up at the ceiling. The power held on, but the wind outside was howling now. I should probably go check the basement, Claire said, uncurling her legs and standing up. Make sure the sump pump is working. Last time it rained like this, we got 2 inches of water down there. I'll go, I said, standing up right after her. You don't need to go down those stairs in the dark if the lights cut out. I know my own house will, she said, but she was smiling. I know you do, I said. But I'm here. Let me do it. She stopped at the top of the basement stairs. She turned around to look at me. The hallway was narrow. I was standing close behind her, closer than I had been all day. I could smell her perfume, something very light like vanilla and clean soap. Thank you, she said. Her voice was a little softer than before. No problem, I said. I walked past her, my arm brushing against her shoulder as I moved down the stairs. It was just a brush. An accident because the hallway was small. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I just walked down the wooden steps into the cool, damp air of the basement. The pump was fine. It was humming along, pushing the water out. I stood there in the dark for a minute, listening to the machine. I took a deep breath. I was letting my mind wander where it had no business wandering. She was Jess's mom. She was just being nice. I was just a guy she trusted to help out. I told myself to snap out of it. I told myself she was just grateful for the extra hand around the house. I checked the pipes one more time to make sure everything was secure. But I couldn't stop remembering the exact feeling of her shoulder brushing against my arm, and the quiet way she had looked at me before I walked down the stairs. I walked back upstairs. By the time I reached the top step, the lights went out completely. The whole house was dark. The power had failed while I was down there. I stepped out of the basement door and saw Claire standing by the kitchen counter. She had found a large white candle and was trying to light it with a small box of matches. Her hands were steady, striking the match against the box. Power's gone, she said, the match flaring up and casting a warm yellow glow over her face. I see that, I said, walking over to her. The kitchen felt smaller now, closed in by the storm outside and the darkness inside. Did the pump look okay? She asked. It's working fine on the battery backup, I said. You're good. She put the glass cover over the candle. The light settled, steady and soft. Well, she said, looking around the dark kitchen. I guess we aren't getting any more work done today. Guess not, I said. Are you hungry? She asked. I can make sandwiches, since the stove is useless. I can help, I offered. We moved around the kitchen island in the candlelight. It was a strange kind of dance. I would reach for the bread while she reached for the plates. We had to move slowly so we didn't bump into each other in the dark. It required a careful kind of attention. I watched her hands moving in the soft light. I noticed the way she focused on slicing the tomatoes, the quiet concentration on her face. She handed me a plate. Our fingers brushed. The porcelain was cold, but her hand was warm. Here, she said. Eat. Thanks, I said. We stood on opposite sides of the island, eating in the quiet. The storm was still raging outside, but inside, the silence between us was growing. It wasn't the easy silence from the living room earlier. It felt a little heavier now. You're very quiet, she said suddenly. I looked up. She was watching me across the candle. Just listening to the rain, I lied. She didn't look away. It's peaceful, she said. Her voice was perfectly normal. But the way she held my eyes made the air in the room feel a little thicker. It was a look that asked a question without saying any words. I told myself she was just making conversation to fill the silence. I told myself I was reading too much into the shadows and the storm. I took a bite of my food and looked away toward the dark window. But I couldn't stop feeling the weight of her eyes on me, steady and calm, waiting for something I didn't know how to answer yet. We finished the sandwiches in that heavy, loaded silence. I gathered the plates, needing something to do with my hands, and carried them to the sink. The rain was coming down in sheets now, washing over the small window above the faucet in a solid, distorting wave. I turned the tap to rinse the plates, the sound of the running water giving me an excuse not to speak right away. I was trying to find the baseline again. I was trying to figure out how to get back to the easy, safe territory we had been standing in just an hour ago. "Well," I said, leaning against the counter and wiping my hands on my jeans. I tried for a casual, easygoing tone. "If the roof caves in under all this water, at least I'm already the guy you'd call to frame it back up anyway." It was a stupid thing to say. A clumsy attempt to remind us both of the roles we were supposed to be playing. Contractor and client. Ex-boyfriend and mother. Claire didn't smile. She was standing on the other side of the kitchen island, the candlelight catching the gold in her eyes. She just looked at me, a long level gaze that completely ignored the joke. The silence stretched out, tightening like a pulled wire. I swallowed hard, the back of my neck suddenly hot. I had completely misread the room. I was projecting my own exhaustion and my own weird, misplaced tension onto a woman who was just trying to eat a sandwich in the dark. I told myself I was an idiot for even letting the thought cross my mind. I told myself she was just tired of the storm and irritated by my terrible attempt at humor. I turned away, grabbing the dry towel from the oven handle to dry the plates I had just rinsed. But I couldn't stop feeling the exact weight of her gaze on the back of my neck, heavy and uncompromising. I set the plates in the drying rack. When I turned back around, she was closer. She had moved around the island and was standing just a few feet away, holding the candle in its glass jar. "I'm not in any rush," Claire said quietly. I looked at her. "For what?" "For the storm to pass," she said. She looked past me toward the dark window and then back up to my face. "Some things are better when the rest of the world is forced to stay outside." It was a simple sentence. It could have meant the stress of her accounting business, or the endless phone calls she fielded all week. It could have meant the noise of the neighborhood. I heard the safe meaning perfectly clear. I also heard the other one. Before I could figure out which one to answer, a sound like a shotgun blast split the air over the house. It was a massive, splintering crack, followed by a heavy, earth-shaking thud that rattled the ceramic plates in the cupboards. We both jumped. Claire grabbed my forearm instinctively, her fingers digging into my sleeve. "What was that?" she asked, her voice tight. "Out front," I said. I pulled a small flashlight from my tool belt, clicking it on as we hurried through the dark dining room to the front window. I pressed the beam against the glass. The old oak tree that had stood at the edge of her property for 50 years had split straight down the middle. Half of the massive trunk, along with a web of thick branches, had come crashing down directly across the driveway. Its heavy limbs were draped entirely over the hood and cab of my truck, pinning it to the concrete. Beyond the driveway, the street itself was a rushing river of brown water, easily a foot deep and rising. "Oh my God," Claire whispered, her hand covering her mouth as she looked over my shoulder. "Will your truck?" "It's insured," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my stomach sank at the sight of the crushed metal. I panned the flashlight across the road. The water was cresting the curb. Even if the tree missed it, I wouldn't be driving anywhere in that flooding. The main road is probably completely washed out by the creek. She stepped back from the window, the reality of it settling over the room. The external world had completely cut us off. "You're stuck here," she said. "Looks like it," I said, turning off the flashlight to save the battery. "Unless you have a boat in the garage." She let out a small breath, a tiny, nervous laugh breaking the tension for a second. "No boat. Just an old kayak with a hole in it." "Then I guess I'm staying put," I said. The immediate crisis of the fallen tree shifted something in the air. The ambiguous tension from the kitchen evaporated, replaced by cold, practical necessity. We moved back into the center of the house, away from the windows. The temperature was dropping steadily now that the air conditioning was off, the damp chill of the storm seeping through the floorboards. "I have a fire pit in the backyard, but that's useless," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "And the fireplace in the living room hasn't been used since winter." "Do you have wood?" I asked. "A small stack in the garage. It should be dry." Let me go get it, I said. For the next half hour the house was just a house and we were just two people trying to stay warm. I carried armfuls of dry oak logs from the garage, stacking them neatly on the brick hearth in the living room. Claire brought in a pile of thick woolen blankets from the hall closet, draping them over the back of the sofa. I rolled up some old newspapers she kept in a basket, tucked them under the kindling and struck a match. The fire caught quickly, the dry wood cracking and popping as the flames licked upward. The orange light spilled out across the living room rug, pushing back the cold shadows. It felt incredibly domestic. I sat back on my heels, watching the fire catch, feeling the heat radiate against my face. Claire came in carrying 2 fresh bottles of water and sat down on the floor, pulling her knees up to her chest, just a few feet away from me. She wrapped a dark blue blanket around her shoulders. I sat down on the rug next to the hearth, stretching my legs out. The silence between us returned, but it had changed again. It wasn't the charged, dangerous silence of the kitchen, and it wasn't the polite, distant silence of the afternoon. It was deeply comfortable. It was the kind of quiet that only happens when you are entirely cut off from the rest of the world, when there is nowhere to go, nothing to fix, and no one else to answer to. We sat there for a long time just watching the flames eat through the bark. "I'm sorry about your truck," Claire said softly, breaking the quiet. "It's just metal," I said, keeping my eyes on the fire. "It can be bent back. Or replaced." "You work hard for your things, Will," she said. "I do," I agreed. I picked up a small iron poker and shifted one of the logs, watching a flurry of orange sparks drift up into the chimney. But getting attached to things you can't control is a good way to stay miserable. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, stripped of that maternal, bright tone she usually carried when people were around. "I used to think this house was the only thing holding me together," she said. I looked over at her. She was staring directly into the fire, the shifting light tracing the soft lines of her face. She looked younger in this light. "When Richard died," she continued, her voice steady but very quiet, "everyone expected me to sell it. It was too big. Too much maintenance for one person. Jess was already moving into her own apartment. It made financial sense to leave. But you stayed," I said. "I stayed," she nodded, tightening the blanket around her shoulders. "I convinced myself that if I kept the house exactly the same, if I kept the deck painted and the roof patched, then the history wouldn't evaporate. I thought I was protecting the memories." She turned her head, looking at me. "But lately," she said, "lately I walk through these rooms and I don't feel like a protector anymore. I feel like a museum curator. Just dusting off exhibits of a life that already happened. Dusting off a version of myself that doesn't really exist anymore." I didn't offer her a platitude. I didn't tell her it was a beautiful home or that her memories were important. She didn't need to hear the things people say to fill dead space. She was telling me something real, something she probably hadn't said out loud to anyone else. "It's hard to stop building around a blueprint you've memorized," I said quietly. She held my eyes. "What did you build your blueprint around, Will?" I looked back at the fire. I thought about the long hours I worked, the way I purposely kept my schedule so packed I rarely had a weekend to myself. I thought about the empty property by the lake I had driven past a dozen times but refused to put an offer on. "Control mostly," I said. The honesty of the room was making it easy to speak, dragging the words out of me without friction. Growing up, we moved every 6 months. Rent was always late. My dad was always chasing some new angle, packing up the car in the middle of the night. Nothing was ever fastened down. I set the iron poker back on its stand. The metal clinked softly against the brick. "So, I learned how to frame houses," I said. "I learned how to sink concrete footings deep into the ground. I learned how to build things that absolutely will not move. I thought if my life was solid enough, if my work was perfect enough, I'd never feel that ground shifting under me again." Claire shifted on the rug, leaning slightly closer. "And did it work?" "For a while," I said. I looked down at my hands. They were rough, calloused, permanently stained with wood finish and dirt. But then you realize you've built walls so thick nothing can actually get in. You spend all your time weatherproofing the outside, and you forget that it's completely empty on the inside. I hadn't intended to say that much. I definitely hadn't intended to say it to her. It felt entirely too exposed. But sitting there in the dark, with the wind rattling the window panes and the rain hammering the roof, the normal boundaries of conversation felt miles away. She didn't speak right away. She reached out from beneath her blanket, her hand resting lightly on the rug between us. Her fingertips were just inches from my knee. "I don't think you're empty on the inside, Will," she said softly. The way she said my name made my chest tight. It wasn't the casual way she called me from the kitchen earlier. It was deliberate, anchored, full of a strange, warm gravity. I looked at her hand, resting there on the braided fibers of the rug. It would be so easy to move my own hand. It would take less than a second to bridge that tiny gap, to let my fingers brush against hers, to test the waters and see if the current I felt pulling between us was real or just a ghost of the storm. But I didn't. I couldn't. I pulled my leg back slightly, shifting my weight away. I reached forward and grabbed the heavy iron poker again, jabbing it into the fire with a sudden, jerky movement. A log broke apart, sending a bright flare of heat into the room. "Well," I said, my voice coming out slightly rougher, slightly louder than it needed to be. "It's a good thing I'm good at fixing foundations then. Keeps me employed." The moment shattered. I felt it break into pieces on the floor between us. Claire withdrew her hand slowly, tucking it back under the blue wool of the blanket. She looked down, her face shadowed as she leaned back against the base of the sofa. The vulnerability that had been sitting openly on her face completely closed up, replaced by a quiet, guarded stillness. I had broken it. I had panicked, retreating to the safety of a stupid, self-deprecating joke, and in the process, I had shut a door she had bravely left open. The comfortable silence we had built was instantly replaced by a sharp, ringing awkwardness. I stared into the flames, a heavy, sick feeling settling in my stomach. I wanted to take the words back. I wanted to reach out, take her hand, and tell her I didn't mean to retreat. But the space between us felt miles wide now. The rain outside seemed incredibly loud. I sat there listening to the storm, feeling the exact shape of the mistake I had just made. The fire was the only thing moving in the room, casting long, erratic shadows against the far wall by the bookcase. I had taken something rare, something genuine that she had offered me in the quiet dark of her home, and I had thrown a cheap, defensive joke at it just to protect my own ego. I waited for her to stand up. I waited for her to gather the blue wool blanket around her shoulders, politely announce that she was exhausted from the day, and walk up the stairs to her bedroom, leaving me alone with the fire and my own stupidity. The minutes dragged out. The wind slammed against the side of the house, shaking the window frames in their tracks, but the sound inside the room was entirely deafening to me. I kept my eyes locked on the burning wood, watching the ash flake away and drop down into the glowing red embers beneath the iron grate. I couldn't bring myself to look at her, terrified that the warmth I had seen in her eyes earlier would be completely gone, replaced by the polite, distant kindness she reserved for strangers and hired help. The temperature in the living room was dropping rapidly now. The fire was hot right next to the hearth, but the heavy, damp chill of the storm was pressing in from the unheated hallways and the kitchen. The draft coming under the front door was carrying a bitter cold that seeped into the edges of the rug. I rubbed my hands together, feeling the rough calluses sliding against each other, trying to figure out a way to break the ice I had just formed. "It's getting colder," I said finally, keeping my voice low and even, stripping out any attempt at humor or deflection. "The upstairs is going to be freezing without the furnace running. I should go up and get the heavy quilts from the hall closet. Bring down whatever extra pillows you have." Claire didn't answer immediately. She kept her chin rested on her knees, the blanket still pulled tight around her. For a terrible second I thought she was just going to ignore me or worse, tell me not to bother because she was going up to sleep anyway. "Top shelf," she said quietly, her voice lacking the sharp edge I had expected. "There are 3 heavy down comforters in the linen closet next to the guest bathroom." I nodded, even though she wasn't looking at me, and pushed myself up off the floor. I grabbed my flashlight from the coffee table, clicking the beam on, and walked out into the dark hallway. The air outside the radius of the fireplace was shockingly cold. I climbed the wooden stairs, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the family photographs lining the wall. The second floor felt completely abandoned. Without the hum of the refrigerator below or the ambient glow of streetlights outside, it was just a silent, freezing corridor. I walked past the closed door of the room that used to be Jess's. I didn't stop. I didn't feel a pang of nostalgia or a sudden rush of old memories. That part of my life felt entirely closed off, sealed away in a different decade, belonging to a younger, different version of myself. My mind wasn't on the past. It was entirely focused on the woman sitting downstairs in the dark, and the stupid heavy wall I had just thrown up between us. I opened the linen closet and pulled down the thick, heavy comforters, burying my face in the clean, cold fabric. I grabbed 4 large pillows from the guest bed, stacking everything into a massive, clumsy pile in my arms. I navigated back down the stairs carefully, the heavy pile of bedding obstructing my view of my own feet. The orange glow of the living room fire was a welcome beacon at the end of the dark hallway. When I stepped back into the room, Claire hadn't moved. She was exactly where I had left her, a quiet silhouette against the firelight. I dropped the heavy pile of blankets onto the center of the sofa. "The temperature up there has to be dropping into the 50s already," I said, pulling the first thick comforter from the pile. "You shouldn't sleep up there tonight. It's too cold." I started dragging the large, square cushions off the sofa, arranging them in a wide, flat rectangle on the thickest part of the rug, directly in front of the hearth. I was focused on the task, operating on pure practical instinct. If I could just build a warm place, if I could just take care of the physical problem, maybe it would make up for the way I had mishandled the emotional one. I heard the soft rustle of fabric. Claire stood up from her spot on the floor. She dropped the blue wool blanket she had been wearing onto the chair, stepping closer to where I was kneeling on the rug. She reached down and grabbed the corner of the heavy white comforter I was unfolding. I froze for a second, looking up. She wasn't retreating. She wasn't angry. She was looking down at me, her eyes reflecting the dancing light of the fire, and there was a quiet, steady resolve in her expression that completely anchored me to the floorboards. She knelt down on the opposite side of the cushions, mirroring my movements. She smoothed the heavy fabric down, her hands moving deliberately. When she reached the center of the makeshift bed, her fingers brushed against the back of my hand. She didn't pull away. She left her hand resting exactly where it was, the side of her thumb maintaining a light, undeniable contact with my knuckles. It was the smallest possible physical connection, but in the heavy quiet of the dark house, it felt like a massive, defining shift. The panic that had been sitting in my chest for the last 20 minutes dissolved instantly. I hadn't broken it. I hadn't ruined the space between us. She had felt me pull back, she had watched me build my stupid little wall, and she had quietly, calmly reached right through it. The rain beat a steady, driving rhythm against the glass of the front window. A heavy log in the center of the fireplace snapped, sending a brief hiss of sap into the orange flames. The room smelled of dry burning oak and the faint, clean scent of vanilla. The temperature in the far corners of the room was bitter and sharp, but the heat radiating from the brick hearth washed over the thick white fabric of the blankets. The light flickered across the woven fibers of the rug. A single shadow stretched out behind her, climbing the wall and bending across the ceiling. The air moved in and out of her lungs in a slow, perfectly even rhythm. The slight pressure of her hand remained anchored against the rough skin of my knuckles, warm and incredibly still. I looked at the space we had just made on the floor. It was wide enough for 2 people, buffered against the cold, trapped in the only pocket of heat left in the entire house. I looked up from her hand, meeting her eyes across the heavy white quilt. "Stay here, storm's too bad," I said. She looked at me. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look away to think about the boundaries or the history or the complications of the world waiting outside the front door. She looked at me and said, "Only if I'm not taking the couch." Like she'd been carrying it a long time. Like she'd finally decided to put it down. I didn't breathe. Not for a long time. My chest felt tight, locked up. The heat of her hand on mine. A complete, total freefall. Then I said, "You aren't taking the couch." The tension in the room didn't snap or break. It just melted, softening into something entirely different. The dangerous, crackling energy that had been hanging between us for hours quietly dissolved, replaced by a deep, undeniable warmth that settled into my bones. Claire smiled. It wasn't the polite smile she used when I fixed her porch, and it wasn't the bright, maternal smile she used when the house was full of guests. It was a slow, private smile, meant only for the quiet space we were currently occupying. She slid closer, shifting her weight on the soft cushions. The distance between us closed without any grand, sweeping movements. It was just a natural, inevitable settling. I moved my hand, turning it over so my palm caught hers. I laced my fingers through hers, feeling the steady, calming pulse at her wrist. Her hand was soft, but her grip was incredibly sure. We didn't need to have a long conversation about what it meant. We didn't need to dissect the history or map out the future. The house was cold, the storm was raging outside, and we were exactly where we were supposed to be. I reached out with my free hand, catching a stray lock of dark hair that had fallen across her cheek. I tucked it gently behind her ear, my fingertips grazing the warm skin of her neck. She closed her eyes for a brief second, leaning into the touch. When she opened them again, the distance between us was entirely gone. The first kiss was slow. It was careful, a gentle question asked and answered in the span of a single breath. The softness of her lips against mine sent a jolt of pure, clear energy straight down my spine. I moved closer, my arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her against my chest. She let out a small, quiet sigh, her free hand coming up to rest against the back of my neck, her fingers tangling slightly in my hair. The kiss deepened, the careful hesitation burning away. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was a slow, deliberate claiming, a hard, grounding reality after hours of floating in ambiguous tension. The taste of coffee and the faint sweetness of her breath became the only things I could focus on. I held her tight, feeling the soft curve of her back under my hand, feeling the solid living warmth of her pressing into me. We pulled back slowly, the firelight catching the slight flush on her cheeks. She rested her forehead against mine, our breathing completely in sync, the quiet rhythm matching the steady fall of the rain outside. I kept my arms around her, burying my face in the curve of her neck, just holding her in the quiet dark. We lay down together on the makeshift bed, pulling the heavy down comforters up over us. The cold from the rest of the house couldn't reach us. The heavy oak logs burned down to bright, glowing embers, casting a low, warm light over the room. I held her close to my chest, my arm tucked securely around her waist, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of her breathing as she drifted off to sleep against my shoulder. The world outside the window was chaotic and flooded, but inside, anchored to the floorboards, everything was perfectly still. Before I finish this, if you've been listening this far, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories travel. And if this one found you somewhere it was supposed to, hit subscribe. A new story goes up every day. Okay, back to where we were. Python. Def print and words. Number. Hashtag generating text to ensure word count. But 52 days passed. The heat of the late summer had finally broken, leaving behind crisp, cool mornings that smelled of dry leaves and damp earth. I pulled my truck, a slightly newer, slightly less battered model than the one that had been crushed by the oak tree, into the driveway of the familiar two-story house. The giant stump in the front yard was the only visible scar from the storm, the massive trunk and branches having been hauled away by a crew weeks ago. I killed the engine, grabbing a small paper bag from the passenger seat, and walked up the front steps. I didn't knock. I just turned the brass handle and walked inside. "I'm in the kitchen," Claire called out. I walked down the hallway, the familiar smell of coffee and something baking hanging in the air. The house felt entirely different now. It wasn't a museum of past memories anymore. It felt alive, bright, and occupied in a way it hadn't been in years. Claire was standing by the island, wearing a dark green sweater, sliding a tray of roasted vegetables out of the oven. She looked up and smiled as I walked in. It was a bright, easy smile that instantly warmed the room. I walked straight to her, wrapping one arm around her waist, pulling her close and kissing her. It was easy. It was an established routine, completely devoid of the careful hesitation that had defined our earlier interactions. "You brought the good bread," she said, leaning back slightly and looking at the paper bag in my hand. "I brought the good bread," I confirmed, setting it on the counter. "The guy at the bakery told me they almost sold out before I got there. I had to bribe him." She laughed, a genuine warm sound that filled the kitchen. She turned back to the counter, transferring the vegetables to a serving bowl. I leaned against the counter, watching her. I watched the confident, relaxed way she moved through the space. The guarded stillness I had seen in her on the night of the storm was entirely gone. "Jess called this morning," she said casually, slicing the bread I had brought. I didn't flinch. The mention of her daughter, my ex, didn't carry the heavy, awkward weight it might have just a few months ago. We had crossed that bridge carefully, communicating with Jess openly and honestly. To our mutual surprise, Jess had laughed, told us we were both adults, and asked if this meant I was going to fix her apartment sink for free now. "Oh yeah," I said. "How's she doing?" "She's good. Busy with the new job," Claire said, arranging the slices of bread in a small basket. She looked up at me, a soft, fond look in her eyes. She asked if you were going to finally finish the deck before winter. Tell her the contractor is highly distracted lately, I said, reaching out to pull her back against me. She leaned into my chest, resting her head against my shoulder as we stood in the warm, bright kitchen. We ate dinner at the small table by the window, talking easily about our days, the work I was doing, the clients she was managing. The conversation flowed naturally, entirely lacking the heavy subtext of the past. When we finished, we cleared the plates together, a synchronized routine that required no instruction. Later we sat on the back deck, the same deck I had been tearing apart on the day the storm rolled in. The sky was clear now, the stars bright and sharp against the dark blue canopy. The air was cool, but I had my arm around her shoulders, keeping her warm against the chill. The silence between us was profound. It wasn't the loaded silence of unanswered questions, and it wasn't the comfortable silence of two strangers trapped in a storm. It was the deep, resonant silence of two people who had finally stopped building walls and started building a foundation. I looked at the wood beneath our feet. I had finished replacing the boards 3 weeks ago. The structure was solid, completely secure. Claire shifted slightly, resting her head against my shoulder. She looked up at the clear sky, taking a slow, deep breath of the crisp air. "The weather is supposed to be clear all week," she said quietly. "That's good," I said, tightening my arm around her slightly. "Means I can finally finish that framing job on the east side of town." She tilted her head up, looking at me. "And after that?" she asked. Her voice was steady, holding a quiet, undeniable strength. "After that," I said, meeting her eyes, "I don't have anywhere else I need to be." She held my gaze for a long moment, the soft porch light catching the gold flecks in her eyes. The quiet confidence in her expression was the exact same look she had given me across the heavy white comforter, the look that had completely unanchored my world. She smiled, a small knowing curve of her lips. "Good," she said simply. "I thought about that moment more than I expected to. I think I always will." 52 days passed. The heavy, oppressive heat of the late summer had finally broken, leaving behind crisp, cool mornings that smelled of dry leaves, wood smoke from distant chimneys, and damp earth. I was driving my truck, a slightly newer, slightly less battered model than the one that had been crushed by the old oak tree, down the familiar winding road that led to her neighborhood. The windows were rolled down, the cool air rushing through the cab, rustling the collar of my flannel shirt. I didn't have the radio on. I just listened to the steady hum of the tires against the asphalt, letting the quiet rhythm of the morning settle into my shoulders. I pulled into the driveway of the familiar 2-story house. The giant stump in the front yard was the only visible scar from the storm, the massive trunk and splintered branches having been hauled away by a crew weeks ago. Where the heavy shadow of the oak used to fall across the concrete, there was now just open, unobstructed sunlight washing over the front steps. I killed the engine, the truck shuddering slightly before going quiet. I grabbed a small brown paper bag from the passenger seat, the warmth of the fresh bread inside seeping through the paper against my palm, and walked up the front walkway. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the doorbell or wait on the porch like a visitor. I just turned the heavy brass handle, pushed the door open, and walked inside. "I'm in the kitchen," Claire called out. Her voice drifted down the hallway, clear and bright, cutting through the quiet of the house. I kicked my work boots off by the mat, leaving them exactly where I had left my wet ones on the day of the storm, and walked down the hall. The house felt entirely different now. It wasn't a museum of past memories anymore, sealed up and carefully preserved. It felt alive, bright, and occupied in a way it hadn't been in years. The air was filled with the rich, dark smell of coffee brewing and the savory scent of something roasting in the oven. Claire was standing by the kitchen island, wearing a dark green sweater that looked incredibly soft, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She was sliding a heavy metal tray of roasted vegetables out of the oven, the heat billowing up around her in a brief, shimmering cloud. She looked up and smiled as I walked into the room. It was a bright, easy smile that instantly warmed the space between us, completely erasing whatever lingering chill I had carried in from the morning air. I walked straight to her, not hesitating, not overthinking the distance or the angles. I wrapped one arm around her waist, pulling her close against my chest, and kissed her. It was easy. It was an established, comfortable routine, completely devoid of the careful hesitation and the agonizing tension that had defined our earlier interactions in this exact room. Her free hand came up to rest against my chest, her fingers curling lightly into the fabric of my shirt. "You brought the good bread," she said, leaning back slightly, her eyes dropping to the paper bag in my hand. "I brought the good bread," I confirmed, stepping back just enough to set the bag on the smooth surface of the kitchen island. "The guy at the bakery told me they almost sold out before I got there. I had to bribe him with a promise to fix the hinge on his front door just to get the last loaf of sourdough." She laughed, a genuine warm sound that filled the kitchen and echoed off the tile backsplash. It was a sound I had come to look forward to, a sound that made the entire house feel completely anchored and secure. She turned back to the counter, using a wooden spatula to transfer the roasted vegetables into a large ceramic serving bowl. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms, just watching her. I watched the confident, relaxed way she moved through the space. The guarded stillness I had seen in her on the night of the storm, the careful way she used to hold herself around me, was entirely gone. She moved with a fluid, easy grace, comfortable in her own kitchen, comfortable with me standing right there watching her. "Jess called this morning," she said casually, reaching for a knife to slice the bread I had brought. I didn't flinch. The mention of her daughter, my ex, didn't carry the heavy, awkward weight it might have just a few months ago. It didn't send a spike of anxiety into my chest or make me want to change the subject. We had crossed that bridge carefully, communicating with Jess openly and honestly. To our mutual surprise, the conversation hadn't ended in disaster. Jess had listened, she had laughed a little, told us we were both adults, and then dryly asked if this meant I was finally going to fix her apartment sink for free now. "Oh yeah," I said, reaching over to steal a small piece of roasted pepper from the bowl. "How's she doing?" "She's good. Busy with the new job," Claire said, arranging the thick slices of sourdough in a small, woven basket. She didn't look up right away, keeping her attention focused on the task, but there was a soft, fond tone in her voice. "She asked if you were going to finally finish the stain on the back deck before winter hits. Tell her the contractor is highly distracted lately," I said, reaching out to pull her back against me. She leaned into my chest, resting her head against my shoulder as we stood in the warm, bright kitchen. I rested my chin against the top of her head, breathing in the clean, familiar scent of vanilla and soap that always seemed to follow her. We stood there for a long time, just letting the morning unfold around us, in no rush to move or break the connection. We ate breakfast at the small wooden table by the window, the same table where she ran her accounting business. We talked easily about our days, the custom framing work I was doing for a client on the east side of town, the endless stream of tax forms she was managing for a local restaurant owner. The conversation flowed naturally, entirely lacking the heavy, careful subtext of the past. I didn't have to watch my words, and I didn't have to worry about stepping on invisible landmines. When we finished eating, we cleared the plates together, moving around the kitchen island in a synchronized, wordless routine that required no instruction or planning. Later that afternoon, we moved outside to sit on the back deck. It was the exact same deck I had been tearing apart on the day the storm rolled in, the same place she had stood holding a glass of ice water, telling me I was going to melt in the heat. The structure beneath our feet was completely solid now. I had finished replacing the rotting boards 3 weeks ago, sinking new screws deep into the joists, ensuring the entire frame was perfectly level and secure. It wasn't going anywhere. The sky above the tree line was clear and blindingly blue, the air sharp and clean. The wind rustled through the remaining trees in the yard, but it wasn't the violent, tearing wind of the storm. It was just a steady, cool breeze. We sat side by side on the outdoor sofa, my arm wrapped securely around her shoulders, pulling her flush against my side to keep the chill away. The silence between us was profound. It wasn't the loaded, dangerous silence of unanswered questions, the kind that makes you want to crawl out of your own skin. And it wasn't the comfortable but desperate silence of two strangers trapped in a dark house, clinging to a fire for warmth. It was the deep, resonant, unshakable silence of two people who had finally stopped building defensive walls and started building an actual foundation. I looked at the fresh wood stretching out beneath our feet, the grain smooth and clean. I remembered the exact feeling of the rain hitting my shoulders as I had scrambled to pack up my tools, the heavy crack of the thunder, the way the dark clouds had swallowed the afternoon. I remembered the heavy, suffocating feeling of trying to control everything in my life, trying to build structures so rigid that nothing could ever hurt me, only to realize I had just built a very effective cage. Claire shifted slightly against me, resting her head heavily against my shoulder. She pulled her knees up, tucking her feet under the edge of my jacket. She looked up at the clear sky, taking a slow, deep breath of the crisp autumn air. "The weather is supposed to be clear all week," she said quietly, her voice barely louder than the rustling leaves. "That's good," I said, tightening my arm around her slightly, feeling the solid, living warmth of her pressing into me. "Means I can finally finish that framing job on the east side of town. Get the roof sealed before the first freeze." She tilted her head up, pulling back just enough to look at me. The soft afternoon light caught the gold flecks in her eyes, making them look incredibly bright. "And after that?" she asked. Her voice was steady. It wasn't a casual question. It held a quiet, undeniable strength, a gentle but firm request to know exactly where we stood. "After that," I said, meeting her eyes and holding them, stripping away any hesitation or deflection. "I don't have anywhere else I need to be." She held my gaze for a long, quiet moment. The cool wind brushed past us, but the space between us felt incredibly warm. The quiet confidence in her expression was the exact same look she had given me across the heavy white comforter in the dark living room, the look that had completely unanchored my world and forced me to drop every defense I had left. She smiled, a small knowing curve of her lips that reached all the way to her eyes. "Good," she said simply. "I thought about that moment more than I expected to. I think I always will."